Hi there, everybody, and welcome to Mastermind Live 2023. First of all, I want to thank you so much for being with us and for joining us today. Throughout, we're going to have, I think, 3.5 hours of really interesting content as we focus on really the art of the possible for procurement. How do we think differently about what procurement can achieve? It's Mastermind Live is our event within our calendar that's really focused on the future. And kind of, increasing our impact and 10xing our impact, something that we talk about all the time. Now, I want to thank, first of all, our sponsors for making Mastermind Live possible. Our presenting sponsor for Mastermind Live 2023 is SAP. And our gold sponsors today are Lavenir AI, Spend HQ, and Supplier.io. So without those, it wouldn't be possible to invest all the time that we invest in creating the content that we have for you today. Now, of course, we really would appreciate your your input throughout the conversations. If you see on the sidebar here, you'll see a chat box. You can pop anything in the chat box. We keep an eye on that through all the sessions. Feel free, pop in where you're coming from, where you're watching from, where you're listening from. Just make sure that works. You can ask your questions in there as you go through each session. There's also a Q&A button as well on that sidebar, which you can always go and put your questions in there too. Those will always come to the host. But I want to welcome you as well. Sitting patiently with me on screen is my co-founder here at Art of Procurement, Kelly Barner. So Kelly, thanks for joining us, but thanks for all the work that you put into the agenda for today.
Absolutely. I was actually taking the opportunity to breathe. It's funny because you talk about all of the work behind the scenes that goes into making a day like this possible. And it starts like any other content that we would create, except at some point a day arrives and it goes live. And so that's where we are. I can't believe that we're here, but I'm incredibly excited about not only the speakers, but the range of topics we're going to cover today. I mean, we are going to take everybody on a journey, everything from procurement influence to procurement metaverse, from supplier diversity and ESG, through stakeholder engagement. So we have a wide range of topics we're planning to dig into. We have some really challenging ideas. We want to leave everybody with inspiration and something new to think about as we wrap up 2023 and prepare to start 2024.
Yeah, it's always you talk about what goes on behind the scenes, and live definitely means live. That's always been one of the things that we've been proud of for these events. Is it is 100% live, and sometimes that means that things happen that you can't necessarily foresee. And it's about keeping our fingers crossed and knocking on wood and all those things that everything goes to plan and the technology works as we hope it to do. But it also just, we really believe in that because of the interaction that it supports and, our ability to jump on questions and comments and things that we get in real time from all of you that are watching today.
Absolutely. And to that point, actually, before I let you transition to our first session, that is something to point out. I mean, our events are known for not having slides. We have a couple of visuals we're going to bring into one of the later sessions today, but you have to give our speakers credit. We do this all the time. We're used to being off the cuff, but every single one of them has bought into the importance of that. They're looking forward to your comments and questions. We'll be keeping an eye on those in each session, but credit to everybody in advance for being willing to take this crazy journey with us.
Yeah, and I already see folks who are joining us from Canada, from Switzerland, from Kansas City, from Dubai. One of the great things about these is that we truly have a global community of folks dialing in from all around the world. And of course, if there's a session that is on the agenda, and PJ, I see from Belgium, welcome, PJ. If there's a session that you don't have time to actually meet because you've got a clash, a meeting, something like that, it will all be available on demand in the platform as soon as the session is over. So you'll be able to go back, watch it. You don't need to wait a few days or anything like that. You've registered, so you're going to have access to everything as soon as the session has finished. All right. Well, with all that said, I think we're going to go into our first session. So I'm going to be joined as Kelly exits stage left, I think. We're going to bring on stage my first guest, who is Dan French. Dan is the CEO of Consider Solutions, and we're going to be talking a little bit around the good news and the bad news about procurement influence today. This is a conversation that gets to the heart of my earlier days in procurement. So I observed a lot of frustration, perhaps even self-pity, and I think I was probably part of that I hate to say, earlier in my career, from procurement teams about our relevancy and, always complaining about the perceived lack of appreciation of our work. So we're going to get into that conversation. So with that said, thank you, Kelly. I know you'll be moderating sessions as we go through the day, and let's bring Dan to the stage. Hey, Dan, I think, let me know, I think you're on mute. If you can just unmute yourself.
You said that things would go a little bit awry, and that was it.
There we go.
I'm just proving the point.
If that is the worst that happens today, I'll be very happy from a technology perspective. So,
Good
first
morning.
of all, how are you doing?
Really good, thanks. Yeah. I'm in the right place, you can see.
I know. Well, we're all going to be staring at that, thinking about, our next wine, I think, as opposed to procurement. But where are you joining us from today?
I am today in London, in sunny London. Well, not so sunny, but at least it's not raining.
Well, we'll take that. And I think your background is one that isn't really procurement focused. You've got more of an executive leadership background from really a number of different organizations, different industries, but you're coming from that kind of outside looking in perspective from procurement. Is that fair? Yeah,
that's pretty fair. I mean, I've kind of been involved from various perspectives in the whole procurement world. And it's kind of fascinating. Whenever you look at any part of business and you have the opportunity to look through a telescope through different ends, it's kind of really interesting. So yeah, definitely. That's been quite a journey.
So we always ask this trademark question, and it's a little bit different, as you alluded to there. You're not necessarily traditionally in procurement, but we always ask, did you find procurement or did procurement find you? So I think, how did you find yourself involved with procurement for the first time?
That's a really, it's a great question, actually, but it made me think when you told me about this that pretty much everything in my career has found me rather than me finding it, which you could regard as laziness or just good fortune, I don't know which. But when I was at school, they suggested I should be a civil engineer. I didn't know what one was, so I looked it up and realized it was building roads and bridges, and I thought, Anyway, I ended up, my first job ended up not being a civil engineer. I ended up being in IT for a beer company, which is a perfect industry for a young person in the height of social activity. So that was a lot of fun. And I worked my way along, and over time, I ended up as part of a professional services business and then a software and services business. And all of those journeys and a kind of high-tech business, they led me to both sides of the customer-buyer relationship, which has been really interesting. Both looking through a procurement lens and looking through a marketing lens and through the kind of the buyer kind of requirement lens.
Well, we're going to dig into that a little bit more throughout the conversation, because I think it's always really interesting to get that outside perspective. Sometimes, very naturally we look a little bit more inwards in terms of the way we think. And, I mentioned it before about that self-pity sometimes that I felt I had as a procurement person, always trying to fight against what you think is the way that procurement is perceived. Now, when we were doing some preparation for the session, you set up kind of a good news, bad news scenario. And I just wondered if you could explain a little bit about, where that came from.
Well, what interests me is, in your introductory comments are right on the money. It's not just in procurement, but in pretty much every business activity. As you develop to a level of skill and expertise, there's a natural period where you go through this kind of feeling of frustration that nobody understands quite the value you're delivering and quite the complexity of the role and how much has to go into getting it right. And you can end up with this sense that, nobody really appreciates what we do, nobody loves us. And the funny thing is that I talk to procurement leaders who feel the same way, but it's not unique to procurement. Finance leaders, CFOs feel the same way. The head of IT, head of manufacturing, data, technology, whatever, they all have the same problem. Why don't they love me more? Why don't they appreciate me more? Why don't they realize how hard this job is? And even the perpetually optimistic chief marketing officer asks the same thing, right? So if they're asking the same thing, it must be part of humanity, not a functional issue.
I think that's a really, really, really important point, because I think that we miss that. And then it's only, you start looking at surveys in other groups, other areas, like the survey of the HR leadership, surveys of finance leadership, survey of IT leadership. And you see the same issues coming up on all those different surveys that you do in procurement. And yet we think that it's just us that's fighting. Everybody else has all the budget that they need. And it's really just procurement that's fighting for budget, and we're the ones kind of at the bottom of the totem pole. But what you're saying is that's not the case at all. Everyone just has that natural perhaps doubt, or that natural desire to be appreciated for what they do, that they feel like they're not necessarily getting just in the world of the corporate structure.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's Maslow's hierarchy of need writ large. I mean, we all have this desire to be appreciated and wanted, and in the world of business, a lot of that gets ignored. I mean, however great job you do, sometimes you don't get the thanks for it. You don't get the recognition. But I mean, I think the good news is, the bad news is nobody loves us. You're right. Nobody does love you. Nobody loves us. It's just the way it is at work. But the good news is it's not specific to procurement, right? Yeah. So everyone's got the same issue. And when you realize that, it does give you a slightly different perspective. Because then you realize these people you talk to, these stakeholders that are frustrating you with their lack of appreciation, have got exactly the same existential woes that we have. So it's kind of interesting. But
yeah, and there's no perfect way to measure impact and value, is there? Because, I think about, you talked about marketing, chief marketing officers being frustrated. And as a procurement person, you might look at marketing and say, marketing has all these wonderful things. They get to spend money and all the things that procurement professionals might like to spend in building their teams up. But at the end of the day, so much of what marketing does is really hard to attribute to the activities that they do, and sales are the ones that then get the rewards, let's say, or the kudos for when a customer or a prospect turns into a customer. So everyone has that journey. It's just a little bit different from what the individual story is, department to department.
Absolutely, it's a funny world. Yeah.
So does everyone feeling the same way actually contribute to a more level playing field in terms of collaboration, or should we look at it in that way?
I think it's interesting. I think the first thing, if we recognize and accept the fact that we're not alone in this feeling of slight lack of self-esteem about the role we're in, and realize everyone's in the same boat. And anybody who says they're not in the same boat probably suffers from a lack of EQ anyway. So you're one up, right? So the great news is, talk to everybody. If people that don't even feel it, then they're missing the point, right? So it is reassuring to know we're not alone. And in a counterintuitive kind of way, it is good for our self-esteem to know that. So once you get rid of this idea that it's not me personally, it's life, right? Yeah. Then, that's pretty cool. That is okay. And you go, okay. And then it's just about how much value can I deliver? Or can my organization deliver? And we've just got to kind of make sure we avoid any sense of superiority about how important we are. I mean, you mentioned marketing earlier. Yeah, it's easy to assume that on the revenue cycle, life is easy. But, you can imagine the sales and marketing leader who says, great, we had 3.5% growth this year. And the executive team look at him and say, well, but we wanted 10.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And it's a bit like, in procurement, we're going to make this many savings at this operating cost. And we kind of, we didn't do that, but we did pretty well. And people, but that's not what we expected. And you go, yeah, okay. So I think everyone has a bit of this imposter syndrome, like, is this really me doing this? And, am I doing well enough and all that stuff? But it is healthy and it keeps us grounded. And I think we can use it as a superpower almost. Yeah. That idea that we think that we're not appreciated, you can turn that to a strength.
So if we... we're always, you mentioned something about revenue, sales and marketing focusing on revenue, procurement more often than not is focusing on the cost side and the expense management. And we're always, it's a narrative we tell ourselves about. We need to convert what we do to be tied to revenue as much as to cost, because then there will be a greater importance placed on procurement if we tie to revenue. Is that reality that within an organization, the revenue side of the business does drive and perhaps has an easier time of demonstrating ROI of investment in their teams than the cost management and the risk management side of the business?
Yeah, I think there's two questions there. One is, is it easier or not? And I think you've got to remember that on the revenue side of the business, most companies for public companies, valuation is massively dependent on revenue. If your revenue is stagnant, it doesn't matter what you do with your cost, you're in a right. So revenue is critically important. But if you're in that driving seat of the revenue cycle and you don't meet expectations, you think we feel bad. That's going to be horrible. So I think so that's an important thing to remember. But then in terms of should we tie everything to revenue? I think we should tie everything to the value and the outcomes perceived by our stakeholders. And that is interesting because we know what value we think we're driving and we're very confident about it. But the challenge, I think, in business is quite often the people that we are, our stakeholders, the leadership, they might not quite agree with what we think is most important. And you know what? The number one thing is you can influence anybody. You can do your best to influence them. But at the end of the day, the business as a whole decides what the priorities are. And if they decide the priorities are A, B, and C, we better get aligned to that.
Yeah.
And we've done, even if we think it should be A, C, and B, and we've done all the influencing we can, if that has not resulted in a change, we might need to consider maybe we haven't got the full picture and maybe that is the right thing. So I think it's really important not to assume that just trying to tie everything to revenue is the right answer, although it does logically make some sense. But it can also be a bit contrived when we try and turn everything into, and look how that would be if it was, cost saving, for example.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? A cost saving isn't the same as revenue. Even if you say a cost saving is 100% margin, therefore it's worth at least twice or whatever of anything, it still doesn't work because as a business, you can't cost save your way to success anyway. Right. So you can't, if you had, and you can't perpetually reduce costs, but theoretically you can perpetually increase revenues.
Yeah.
So I think it's kind of important not to get too hooked up on it, but to make sure we spend a lot of time collaborating across the organization, not just with leadership, but everyone across the organization. What we're really trying to do here, what does good look like for the business as a whole? And what can we do to really contribute to that? And I think assuming it's always revenue is a dangerous assumption.
Yeah, I do always struggle with that when I see people in procurement or even providers in procurement, when they're talking about the business case, tying savings to, well, this is equal to this amount of revenue. For exactly what you say, but I see it all the time, and I think because back in the, I don't know, age myself in terms of my time in procurement, but probably the early 2000s, I remember some stat by Aberdeen Group at the time, who would say something like $1 saved is equal to $9 in revenue or something like that. I'm kind of making up the numbers, but that was the intent. And so then that's a lot of organizations use that to try and fuel the investment in procurement, saying, and as you said, that's, the revenue compounds, cost savings doesn't necessarily compound. Yeah, and so I agree with you in that it's a dangerous game to try and tie all of your ROI based on the fact that, well, we're saving you from having to generate this amount of revenue by what we're saving. Actually, you're allowing us to reinvest back in the business or to reallocate cash back to shareholders or whatever it is that we might be doing. But saving money on its own isn't growing revenue.
No, I agree with you completely. And I think it is a dangerous argument to try and tie everything to revenue. For all the reasons you describe, I think it's, we've just got to recognize that we're a key kind of component in the engine of business, absolutely critical, but it's not about anybody's more important than anybody else. I mean, even when we talk about revenue, it's not about relative importance. The whole machine doesn't work unless it's all the cogs are working, right?
Right.
I mean, if your revenue generation machine's working fine, but your supply chain's broken, it won't last very long. So it doesn't really matter.
Now, sometimes I feel you talked about business alignment and alignment with business strategy. And actually, most of those organizations you talked about before who also feel this, fight for relevancy, would it make more sense that we're going to them collaboratively saying, okay, this is, we identify and understand this is what the business is trying to do. How can we partner to do that collectively? As opposed to what I feel we sometimes do is we go and say, we've got a goal that we've got to hit. And, you're almost like the vehicle to allow me to hit my individual goal.
No, I absolutely agree with that. And I think if we can work together with colleagues across the business and say, how can we collectively if we know what good looks like, and it's usually certainly for public companies, it's pretty obvious, but usually you can work that out and make sure you're clear on it. Then say, how do we collectively drive what we do to deliver on this? And most of these things are not simplistic. It's not a one gear game. It's not like, let's put procurement into overdrive. It's about how do we get the right balance of supply, of marketing, of target addressable market, all that stuff, and resources. Because we might be doing a great job in sourcing and doing wonderful contract negotiations, but if they're the wrong contract negotiations, or if the business is not able to take advantage of them, we all fail. There's no prizes for saying, well, we did fine, it was the other people that ruined it. It doesn't work.
We're all in the same boat at the end of the day.
Exactly.
Now, one of the terms that I have a pet peeve with the most in procurement is when we talk about needing a seat at the table. But again, I hear that a lot. Is there anything freeing about not having that seat at the table that actually is a benefit for you, as opposed to seeing it as, well, I don't have that influence or that direct influence, and therefore that's a bad or a negative thing?
Well, I think having a seat at the table is a euphemism for two things. One is I should be in the executive team, but the other one is having a seat at the table is being part of all the important conversations. And they don't necessarily, and actually the most important conversations don't happen necessarily with the executive team all there. So I think it's really important to make sure we earn the right to have a seat at the table. Bring your own seat, bring your own chair. And if you have, there's no doubt at all, if you have the respect of your colleagues and leaders, that you have got a balanced, professional, experienced view with some insights, you will be asked to join that table. Now, that table might not be the executive committee, but it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. It's about where do we most deliver value. So I think that's a key point. And then in terms of being part of the executive committee, I used to think that must be brilliant being the CEO. You've got it's a dream job. You've got no one to answer to. You can set your own goals. Everyone is a winner. And then you realize actually it's not like that. And you speak to anybody. In fact, that's probably the loneliest job in business. So we worry about self-esteem about procurement. If you ended up being the CEO, you'd probably wish, I'd like to go back a few steps. I mean, once you're on the C-suite, there is no one to blame for your decisions, only yourself. In fact, there's no one to blame for anybody else's decisions. It's still your fault. And then all the successes are down to the people who contributed to it. So, you've got to have a pretty strong kind of self-esteem, survival instinct to do that. So the C-suite is also a place that nobody loves you. And that's the irony, right? So even the CEO probably wakes up in the morning and goes, nobody loves me, nobody cares, nobody knows how hard this job is. And we're going, yeah, but nobody knows how hard my job is either. So I think it's a really interesting point.
Yeah, and so the CEOs that I know of larger organizations, trust is really hard as well, because it's how do you really decipher what is real and what is folks doing and saying things for the benefit of their career. And I think that as much from a procurement perspective as you can kind of be transparent in your dealings, not try and hide things or sandbag things or whatever it may be, anything you can do to kind of give that trust, because every CEO is looking for somebody in the organization they can trust. And there aren't that many people, at least again, from the CEOs, the big companies I've talked to really struggle with that.
And people that will tell you their perspective on reality, and they won't sugarcoat it, but equally they won't try and catastrophize it either, because there's nothing worse. You know what it's like. You can sugarcoat, you can make it look like everything's wonderful when it isn't, but it's equally bad to catastrophize everything's a complete disaster when it isn't. And we do that. I'm guilty of that. We're all guilty of that. Sometimes, this is a complete mess. Well, actually, it's not. It's got a couple of little bits that need sorting out.
So how, as you're trying to navigate through an organization structure and perhaps you don't have the ear of the CEO or the C-suite, how do you start to think about like mapping where the points of influence are? Which are the relationships that actually I should be focusing on building, because ultimately that's going to lead to the influence that I want to drive. It just might be doing it indirectly. Yeah,
I mean, wherever you sit in the organization, you've got some pretty obvious organizationally near stakeholders, and you've got some softer, further out stakeholders. And I think it's all about I think it's a mindset about focusing on value you can deliver or your organization can deliver, but value in other people's eyes, not in your eyes. What is value to them? And it's almost like there's a lovely little acronym I use occasionally, the WIFM, what's in it for me, which is a wonderful thing, but it's really meant to be what's in it for you. So when you're talking to other people, so what's in it for them? Why, does it really matter to them if I get another few points off these arrangements or not? Or would they rather we put our effort in somewhere else?
Yeah.
And by the way, part of the issue about value in other people's eyes, we've all got to be very, very conscious of the fact that sometimes our performance measures and rewards are not properly aligned with what the organization is trying to do. So one way to make sure you miss the what's in it for me is focus on the performance measure and reward, which is slightly screwy anyway, and talk to people about it, because they go, I think you're missing the point. That's not what we care about.
So let's go there then with savings, and I think that's for procurement. That's how we got the investment to drive the growth of procurement. I think through the 2000s, through the 2010s, and professionalize, if you will, procurement is based on ROI of cost savings. And so we've kind of created this rod for our own back, where now that's what the business expects from us to demonstrate what our ROI is, because that's what we made the business case on. But that's not necessarily what the business needs from us. I wonder if you have any tips on how to manage that, inconsistency, if you will. There's an expectation that we got to get the savings to say, hey, this is the reason we exist. But at the end of the day, you can hit your savings target and you can still be fired because you annoyed all the rest of the business and you pushed them in directions that they don't want to go to. But I think that balance is really, really, really hard for procurement to kind of, figure out what's the best way of approaching it.
Oh, I'm with you completely. I think if you come back to first principles, that you cannot perpetually save your way to success. So one of the challenges is you do, as you say, you create a rod for your own back. When you start with a savings goal, that's fine, but you've got to revisit it every year and say, is this still the most important thing? Because actually savings isn't the most important thing.
No.
It is, supply and availability and timeliness of supply in a business where that direct supply chain affects revenue is probably the most important thing. And actually, if you were to look at the past 3 years, that's become very obvious because people were happy to pay over the odds to make sure the supply chain worked. So it's not just about the money. So I think that's kind of that is kind of quite important. And so it's kind of security of supply. It's also the risk management. Are we dealing with the risk? We might have different risk tolerance for different categories of supply, but it's having a bit of a sensible debate about that, because it isn't one rule for all. So that's a bit of part of the issue. And the other piece might be the bit about controlling spend. And I don't really like the word control because it doesn't go down very well in a what's in it for me discussion. But there's a lot of spend which may be kind of inadvertently not going in quite the right direction. And helping the organization get control of that, and I think that's an important way of describing it rather than us getting control of it, helping the organization get control of it, there's a lot of value in that. And what all this leads me to is I'm a big believer in the fact there are no single performance indicators for any area of business. And I'm a big believer in the balanced scorecard, this idea, look at it through different lenses. And for most areas of business, there's not one performance measure. There's probably 4 or 5 really important ones, which have got to be managed in balance. And if you can work out with your stakeholders and your colleagues and your customers in the business what really matters, and then develop, and hopefully as an organization, as a procurement organization, say, right, this is what our top 5, this is our balanced scorecard of what matters to us. Cost savings will only be one of them. And I think that's a really healthy, because part of the problem is our colleagues in the rest of the business also don't even believe some of the stuff about cost savings. They think it's all manufactured. And there are evidence, there is
sometimes it is.
It does get manufactured, because if you're asked to achieve a single goal A, and the same thing happens on the revenue cycle as well, you're asked to achieve a single goal A, there's a way of achieving it, but if life gets hard, there's a way of gaining it. What's the point?
Do we, need to be comfortable with the fact that not all performance can be measured with data. And or because as procurement people, we're very data driven. And so I think that's one of the things that we like about cost savings as a function, because while, as you said, sometimes that data can be manufactured, we call it procurement math, and it definitely exists. It's also a black and white kind of, here's a number that demonstrates the value. Why don't you all understand that that's the value we created? Whereas so much of the impact you had is very subjective rather than objective.
I agree with that completely. I mean, I do think data is an interesting topic, particularly right now. Data is king in some respects, but the reality is, and we've just touched on it, is data is really, really important, but you've got to be sure you got the right data and you're measuring the right stuff. And because by definition, data is everywhere, you can choose what to measure. And that's one of the problems in an organization, where your colleagues and stakeholders sometimes feel you're measuring the wrong thing, or you're measuring the right thing using the wrong variables, which happens a lot, right? So that's kind of interesting. But coming back to your key point, I'm absolutely convinced that the idea of, do our stakeholders and colleagues in the business, do they feel that we are contributing to a common goal and doing the best we can and doing the best with the resources we have? To be honest with you, that is a single measure that's more important, and there is no data for that. I mean, you could argue you could use NPS scores, but I think it's even more subtle than that. I think you've got to know. I was talking to a friend of mine who, well, I shouldn't laugh really, but he got fired. He didn't know why. And he was quite a senior position. He got fired. And I had to explain to him, I said, if you're in a senior role and your stakeholders become so dissatisfied about what your organization is delivering relative to their expectations, that's your problem, not theirs.
Yeah.
I had to say it very nicely, but it is. It's not their problem. If you didn't see that coming, you're not having the right conversation. Because if you're not saying to them, so how is it work? Are we doing the right things? What could we do better? What should we stop doing? What can we do differently? And if you're not asking that question, everything can go wrong.
Yeah, you need to, at the end of the day, as a procurement group, you need to think of yourself as a service provider, right? And I think you get that perspective perhaps when you step out of procurement and go into more sales or services-based roles, and you see that at the end of the day, you've got to provide a value proposition that's compelling enough for somebody to want to come to you and have support from you, rather than just exist and expect that people will come your way.
Absolutely. Now, everything in business is a service one way or the other. Even the sales and marketing folks are providing a service to the rest of the business. Nobody's running a kind of an independent business.
Yeah. Now, I know we're running up on just a couple of minutes left, but I want to just tap into getting everybody on the same page so that all your stakeholders are in agreement with what your goals are. And so how important is governance in that, and actually bringing the right leaders together? So collectively, you're kind of determining what your goals are as a group with your stakeholders, as opposed to just doing it on your own, or perhaps with your CFO.
Yeah, I think it's really important to get wide, and not just with executives, around peers across the organization, and work out what everyone's view of what good looks like for the organization, because that varies a bit as well. So you get this kind of slightly amorphous view, but you get a general trend, but you also know what's coming from the CEO and CFO in terms of the financial expectations. You understand what good looks like, and you say, so how do we play to that? What are the most important things we can do? And you talk to people and you create that kind of developing, refined, balanced scorecard, if you like.
Yeah.
And you might end up with like 10 things. You go, well, we can't have 10 things that are important, but then you've realized some of them are the same. And then it's a good idea to go back to those same colleagues, stakeholders, and executives to say, we've talked across, we collaborated across the organization. We're getting the sense this is the most important way we can contribute. What's your view? Rather than saying this is it, just saying this is what we gather. What do you think? And they might say, well, that's really interesting. I don't agree with number 3. And you say, well, why not? Because everyone else in the organization thinks number 3 is really important. And then you have an interesting conversation. And then you're being regarded as a value creator, rather than, you're stimulating a healthy debate rather than trying to defend a position. And I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and when they then say that you can't do things because we don't have the bandwidth, it's something that's agreed on between all stakeholders. That's for the right reasons, and it's for the good of the business. It's not just because you're being difficult.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Dan, I know it's time to wrap up. I want to thank you so much for joining us and kind of setting us on the path of how to influence our stakeholders, how to be comfortable about the fact that everyone's in the same situation as we are. And I think with that mindset, it really kind of puts you on a level playing field, if you will, in terms of thinking about how you can make a difference and what are some of the ways that you can make a difference other than, everybody just looking at that savings number and saying, well, good job or not so good job.
Exactly.
So truly appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much, Philip. I really appreciate it. Enjoy your day, everyone. It's going to be a great day. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And actually, were you talking about balanced scorecards is a great segue into our next session. So everybody can go out into the lobby. You'll find the next session that's going to start in about 5 minutes time. That's going to be on managing stakeholder engagement by measuring procurement's impact. And we're going to be advice on using KPIs, balanced scorecards to increase engagement and collaboration. So we're going to do a bit of a deeper dive on that one. That's going to be hosted by my colleague, Helen. So Dan, one last time, thanks so much.
Thank you very much. See you soon.
Thanks. Take care, everybody.